I did not take back this land for power. I took it back so every Burkinabé, rich or poor, can finally stand on soil that truly belongs to them. Those words were not spoken in a palace. They were not written by diplomats. They came from the heart of a man who understood something the world had forgotten. Land is not just earth beneath your feet. It is life. It is dignity. It is the line between freedom and dependence. In 2025, Burkina Faso made a decision that shocked the global order. The government declared that every single inch of land now belongs to the state. No individual, no corporation, no foreign government can claim permanent ownership. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. This was not an act of aggression. It was an act of truth. For over 100 years, land in Africa has been quietly taken, leased, bought, and manipulated by forces that never planted a single seed on it. Farmers lived on land they did not own. Villages were erased for mining projects. Communities became strangers on the soil their ancestors had walked for centuries. With one law, Burkina Faso ended that chapter. The announcement did not roar, it whispered, but the whisper carried across the entire continent. And the world, used to controlling Africa through contracts and loans, suddenly realized Africa is no longer waiting for permission. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. This is a hinge in history. If this story resonates, show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription. It means more than numbers. It keeps the story alive. For decades, Africa has faced a crisis that never made the front page. It was not a war. It was not a famine. It was something quieter, something slower, but just as devastating. It was the loss of land. This loss did not happen with soldiers or tanks. It happened through contracts signed in air-conditioned offices, through deals negotiated in foreign languages, through leases that stretched across generations. Thousands upon thousands of hectares were quietly transferred into the hands of foreign corporations, investors, and governments. The land was used for mining, for large-scale farming, for oil extraction, for tourism resorts that locals could never afford to enter. And the people who had lived on that land for centuries, they were pushed aside. In Burkina Faso, as in many African nations, this pattern became normal. A farmer would wake up one morning to find that the plot his grandfather had cultivated was no longer his. A foreign company had purchased it, or a local elite connected to power had claimed it. The farmer had no papers, no lawyers, no voice. So he moved. He rented a smaller piece of land. He worked harder for less. And he lived with the constant fear that one day even that small plot would be taken too. Women who did most of the agricultural labor owned almost nothing. They planted, they harvested, they fed their families, but the land was never registered in their names. If a husband died, if a landlord demanded payment, if a corporation arrived with bulldozers, these women had no legal ground to stand on. They were invisible in the system that controlled their survival. Young people watched this cycle and made a choice: leave. They left the villages for the cities, searching for jobs that often did not exist. They crossed deserts and oceans, hoping to find dignity somewhere else, because the land, their inheritance, their future, had already been sold. And the saddest part? Much of this land was used to grow food that would never feed Africans. It grew crops for export. Europeans ate tomatoes grown on African soil, while African children faced malnutrition. Chinese factories processed cotton picked by African hands, but the profits flew overseas. The land was fertile, the people were hard-working, but the system was designed to extract, not to nourish. This was not unique to Burkina Faso. It was the story of Kenya, of Tanzania, of Mozambique, of Ghana. Across the continent, the same silent theft occurred, generation after generation. And the world called it progress. They called it investment. They called it development. But the people knew the truth. This was not development. This was dispossession. And for a long time, it seemed as though nothing could change it. The elites benefited, the foreign powers benefited, and the people, they simply endured. Until one leader said, "Enough." At this point, let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to Traoré, to Burkina Faso, or to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality. It is recognition. It is dignity expressed. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video. You are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and pride. So, before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. Ibrahim Traoré did not arrive in power through tradition. He came through revolution, a revolution born not from ambition, but from the exhaustion of a people who had been robbed too many times. And when he stood before the nation, he did not offer them promises. He offered them a mirror. He showed them what they had lost, and then he showed them what they could reclaim. The law was simple in its language, but radical in its meaning. All land in Burkina Faso now belongs to the state, not to individuals, not to corporations, not to foreign governments. The state would act as custodian, guardian of the soil, protector of the future. No one could buy land, no one could sell it. Ownership, as the world understood it, was abolished. To outsiders, this sounded extreme. To the people of Burkina Faso, it sounded like justice. Under the old system, land was treated like a commodity. If you had money, you could buy as much as you wanted. If you were connected to power, you could claim even more. Wealth determined access. The richest controlled the best land, the fertile valleys, the riversides, the mineral-rich zones. The poorest were left with scraps, with plots too small to sustain a family, with soil too exhausted to grow anything but dust. This inequality was not an accident. It was the result of a system designed during colonization and never truly dismantled. Even after independence, the rules remained the same. Land could be bought and sold. Foreigners could own it. Elites could hoard it. And the majority, the farmers, the herders, the families, had no security at all. Traoré's reform shattered this structure. By making the state the custodian, he removed land from the marketplace. It could no longer be auctioned to the highest bidder. It could no longer be used as collateral for loans that trapped families in debt. It could no longer be quietly transferred to foreign hands through legal loopholes. Instead, the government would allocate land based on need and contribution. A farmer who works the soil has a right to it. A family building a home has a right to it. A woman raising children and growing food has a right to it. Not because they can pay, but because they are citizens. This shift transformed the meaning of land. It was no longer property. It was a shared foundation, a commons that belonged to everyone and could be taken by no one. For the elites, this was a nightmare. Wealthy families who had controlled thousands of hectares suddenly found themselves subject to the same rules as everyone else. They could no longer pass vast estates to their children. They could no longer leverage land for political power. The playing field, for the first time in over a century, was level. For foreign investors, the message was clear. You are welcome to work here, but you will not own here. You can lease land for a defined period, but the terms will be set by Burkina Faso, not by you. You will align with national priorities, food security, job creation, environmental protection, or you will not operate at all. Some corporations withdrew immediately. They had no interest in a system where they could not own, could not control, could not extract without limit. And Traoré did not stop them. In fact, he opened the door and watched them leave. Because he understood something the world had refused to accept. Burkina Faso did not need investors who saw the land only as profit. It needed partners who saw it as life. This was not anti-development. It was anti-exploitation. The reform did not close Burkina Faso off from the world. It simply set boundaries. It said, we will trade, we will cooperate, but we will not surrender. Our land is not negotiable. Most importantly, the law restored something sacred. Long before colonization, African communities understood land as more than property. It was heritage. It was the bones of ancestors beneath the soil. It was the future written in seeds. Land connected generations, the living to the dead, the present to the yet unborn. Traoré's reform reconnected Burkina Faso with that ancient understanding. It said, this land does not belong to us. We belong to it, and we will protect it, not as owners, but as guardians. The world called this radical. The people called it long overdue. But reclaiming the land was only step one. What came next would define the nation's future. A law can change the rules, but it cannot, by itself, change lives. That requires action, deliberate, strategic, and deeply human. Once Burkina Faso declared that the land belonged to the state, the real work began: redistribution. This was not about handing out plots randomly. It was about using land as a tool to build a stronger, fairer, and more self-reliant nation. The government called this Phase 2, and it focused on 3 groups who had been excluded for far too long: small farmers, women, and youth. Small farmers had always been the backbone of Burkina Faso's economy. They grew the millet, the sorghum, the vegetables that fed the nation. Yet for decades, they had worked on borrowed land. They rented from landlords, from elites, from foreign companies. Every season brought uncertainty. Would the lease be renewed? Would the price increase? Would the land be sold to someone else? This fear made it impossible to plan, impossible to invest, impossible to improve. A farmer who does not own the soil will not build a well. He will not plant trees. He will not rotate crops. He survives season to season and no further. Phase 2 ended that precarity. The state began allocating land directly to small farmers, not as a gift, but as a right. Farmers received secure access to plots large enough to sustain their families and produce surplus for the market. But land alone was not enough. The government understood that. So along with the land came support, training in modern irrigation techniques, access to quality seeds, education in crop rotation and climate-resilient farming. These farmers were not just given soil, they were given the tools to make it thrive. And it worked. Within months, production increased. Farmers who had struggled to feed their own children now had enough to sell. Markets in the towns grew fuller. Food prices stabilized. The nation, slowly but surely, was beginning to feed itself. Next came the women. For generations, African women had been the invisible force behind agriculture. They planted, they weeded, they harvested. They processed the grain, they sold it at the market, they fed the children. Yet legally, they owned almost nothing. If a husband died, the land passed to his brothers. If a landlord evicted the family, the woman had no claim. She could work the soil her entire life and still end up with nothing. Traoré's government recognized this injustice and moved to correct it.
Women's cooperatives began receiving land allocations for farming, for livestock, for food processing enterprises. These were not token gestures. These were real parcels of productive land, managed collectively by women who knew exactly what to do with them. The impact was immediate. Women who had lived independence suddenly had income. They expanded vegetable gardens. They raised goats and chickens. They started small businesses, grinding grain, making shea butter, drying fruits. And when women control resources, entire communities benefit. Children eat better, school attendance rises, health improves, income becomes stable. The land given to women did not just empower individuals, it lifted families, it strengthened villages, it built futures. Finally, there was the youth. Half of Burkina Faso's population is under the age of 17. For years, young people saw no future in the countryside. The land was controlled by elders or outsiders. There were no opportunities, no innovation, no hope. So they left. They went to the cities, to other countries, chasing dreams that often turned into nightmares. Phase 2 offered them a reason to stay. The government began allocating land specifically for young entrepreneurs interested in agriculture. But not the old kind of farming. This was agrotech. This was innovation. Solar-powered irrigation systems, seed development programs, fruit drying and packaging businesses, storage solutions that reduced post-harvest losses, rural cooperatives that connected directly to urban markets. The message to the youth was clear. The land is not the past. It is the future, and you can shape it. Young people responded. They formed collectives. They attended training programs. They brought new energy, new ideas, new technologies to the soil their grandparents had worked. And in doing so, they began to see the countryside not as a place to escape, but as a place to build. Phase 2 was not charity. It was strategy. By prioritizing farmers, women, and youth, Burkina Faso was investing in the groups most capable of transforming the nation. These were the people who understood the land, who depended on it, who would protect it. They were not extracting wealth to send elsewhere. They were building wealth to keep at home. And this strategy extended beyond agriculture. The government also reserved land for industrial zones, but with a critical rule. Priority goes to Burkinabé-owned businesses and regional African partners, not foreign monopolies. The goal was simple but revolutionary. Grow it here, process it here, sell it here. For too long, Africa had exported raw materials only to buy them back at finished products at 10 times the price. Burkina Faso was determined to break that cycle. If the nation grew tomatoes, it would also produce tomato paste. If it grew cotton, it would also weave cloth. If it raised livestock, it would also process meat and dairy. Every step of the value chain would happen on Burkinabé soil, creating jobs, generating income, and building expertise. This was not isolation. It was intelligent self-reliance.
And it sent a powerful message. We are not a source of cheap resources. We are a nation capable of producing, processing, and prospering. Now, let us turn this story into a shared moment. Write in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, your corner of the world. Rise of Africa will read them with gratitude, and we send to each of you a heartfelt wish. May your journey be filled with dignity, hope, and light. This is more than a video. It is a gathering of voices across the globe. But the world was watching, and not everyone was happy. When Burkina Faso announced its land reform, the response from the West was swift and predictable. Within days, media outlets began publishing warnings. Analysts appeared on television, shaking their heads with concern.
Diplomats made quiet phone calls. The message, delivered in 1,000 different ways, was always the same. This is dangerous. This is reckless. This will destroy your economy. But behind the concern was something else: fear. The West has always understood one fundamental truth: whoever controls the land controls the future. Land is not just soil. It is food security. It is water access. It is minerals, energy, and strategic positioning. For centuries, Western powers maintained influence over Africa by controlling access to these resources. They did not need to govern directly. They simply needed contracts, leases, and agreements that gave them ownership or guaranteed access. Burkina Faso's reform threatened to dismantle that system entirely. If land could not be owned by foreigners, if leases were short-term and conditional, if national priorities came before corporate profits, then the old playbook no longer worked. Western companies could not secure the resources they had come to expect. Western governments could not leverage land deals for political influence. The power dynamic, for the first time in over a century, was shifting. And so, the pressure began. Some embassies delayed visa approvals. Certain aid programs were quietly paused. Investment conferences removed Burkina Faso from their agendas. International financial institutions expressed concern about the business climate. The message was clear: reverse this decision or face consequences. But something unexpected happened. Burkina Faso did not collapse. It did not panic. It did not beg for forgiveness. Instead, the nation kept moving forward. Farmers continued planting. Cooperatives continued forming. Local industries continued growing. And the people, rather than feeling isolated, felt stronger. Because they understood something the West had miscalculated. Sanctions and pressure only work when a nation is dependent. Burkina Faso was choosing to become self-reliant. The world is no longer unipolar. Africa is no longer alone. When Western investors withdrew, others arrived. Partners from Asia, from the Middle East, from Latin America. Nations that understood mutual benefit rather than extraction. Regional alliances within Africa itself grew stronger. Mali and Niger stood with Burkina Faso, together breaking away from the colonial currency system that had kept them tethered to France for decades. The sanctions that once seemed terrifying now looked like something else. Proof that Africa was rising. Proof that the old powers were losing their grip. Proof that fear, when faced with dignity, loses its strength. Western media continued to warn of economic disaster. But in Burkina Faso, food production was increasing. Employment was growing. Communities felt safer. And the people began to ask a question that had not been asked loudly enough before. If the West is so concerned about our decisions, perhaps those decisions are exactly right. Sanctions are not signs of African weakness. They are signs of Western fear. Fear that control is slipping. Fear that Africa is waking. Fear that the era of silent exploitation is ending forever. And Burkina Faso was not alone. What happened in Burkina Faso was not an isolated event. It was part of a wave, a growing movement across the continent where nations are reclaiming their sovereignty, one decision at a time. The spark was lit earlier, in South Africa. In 2024, the South African government revived its push for land expropriation without compensation. The proposal was bold, controversial, and deeply symbolic. South Africa, with its painful history of land dispossession under apartheid, was finally confronting the reality that political freedom means little when economic power remains in the hands of a few. The announcement sent shockwaves through global markets, but it also sent a different message to the rest of Africa. It is possible to challenge the system. It is possible to say no. Burkina Faso watched, and then it acted. By 2025, Ibrahim Traoré had gone further than South Africa. He did not propose gradual reforms or lengthy negotiations. He simply nationalized all land. No debates, no delays.
The decision was made, and the nation moved forward. It was a declaration that Africa's future would no longer be written by foreign investors or former colonial powers. And the movement did not stop there. In Kenya, debates over land rights intensified. In Namibia, discussions about reparations and restitution gained momentum. In Zimbabwe, a nation that had already undergone controversial land reforms decades earlier, leaders pointed to Burkina Faso as proof that African solutions, however criticized by the West, could work. In Tanzania, voices grew louder calling for greater control over natural resources. This was not coordinated by governments alone. It was driven by the people. University students organized forums on sovereignty. Farmers gathered in markets to discuss land justice. Social media across the continent buzzed with support for leaders who refused to bow to external pressure. Hashtags celebrating African independence trended for weeks. Songs were written, murals were painted. A generation that had grown up watching their nations negotiate away their futures was now demanding something different: dignity. What made this movement powerful was its roots. It was not imposed from above. It grew from below, from communities tired of losing, from families exhausted by insecurity, from young people determined to build futures on land they could actually call theirs. And it was not about rejecting the world. It was about redefining the terms of engagement. African nations were saying, we will trade, we will cooperate, we will welcome investment, but not at any cost. Not if it means surrendering our land. Not if it means repeating the mistakes of the past. Not if it means our children inherit poverty on mineral-rich soil. Regional alliances began to strengthen. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger formed a bloc, rejecting French monetary control and exploring new economic partnerships. The African Continental Free Trade Area gained renewed energy as nations realized that unity was not just a slogan, it was survival. The more Africa traded with itself, the less it depended on powers that had historically exploited it. This awakening was not loud, it was steady. It was the quiet decision of a farmer to plant on secure land. It was the determination of a woman to register her cooperative. It was the choice of a young person to stay in the village and innovate rather than flee to uncertain cities. Burkina Faso did not start this movement, but it became its clearest symbol. A small, landlocked nation that refused to be afraid. A leader who chose honesty over approval. A people who stood together when the world expected them to fracture. Sovereignty is no longer a dream. It is becoming a daily practice. And once the people rise, the map begins to change. Before we close, let us pause. Not to end, but to recognize what you have just witnessed. This is not simply a story about land. It is not just a policy change in a distant nation. This is a story about dignity reclaimed, about sovereignty declared, about a people who decided that their future would not be written by others. What Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso have done is remind us all that independence is not given, it is taken, not through violence, but through courage, not through isolation, but through clarity. They have shown that a nation does not need permission to protect its soil, to feed its children, to stand tall in the face of global pressure. And this story is not over. It is only beginning. If this message has moved you, if you believe in the right of nations to determine their own destiny, if you stand with those who choose dignity over dependence, then subscribe to this channel. Not because we ask for numbers,
not as a favor, but as a commitment. Rise of Africa is building a space where these voices are honored, where these stories are told, where the unfolding chapters of African sovereignty are shared with the world. By subscribing, you are not just supporting a channel, you are joining a movement. You are saying, I see this, I hear this, I stand with this. The next video will not just continue the story. It may reshape how you see the continent, how you understand power, and how you imagine the future. Africa's story is still being written. Every voice that joins makes the chorus stronger. Subscribe now and stand ready for the chapter that comes after this one, because what is happening in Burkina Faso is not an ending. It is a seed planted in the soil of history, and the harvest is yet to come. Let us return to where we began, to the words of a man who did not take power for himself, but reclaimed it for his people. I did not take back this land for power. I took it back so every Burkinabé, rich or poor, can finally stand on soil that truly belongs to them. This was not rhetoric. It was a promise, and it was kept. In 2025, Burkina Faso did what many thought impossible.
It ended over a century of foreign control, elite domination, and silent dispossession. It said to the world, our land is not for sale. It belongs to the people who work it, who live on it, who will pass it to their children. It declared that sovereignty is not just a word spoken at independence ceremonies. It is a daily practice, a choice made again and again to protect what is sacred. The law was clear. The state became the custodian. No one could own land permanently, not corporations, not foreigners, not even wealthy elites. Instead, access was granted based on citizenship, on need, on contribution. Farmers received security, women received recognition, youth received opportunity, and the nation received something it had not felt in generations: hope. Phase 2 turned that hope into action. Land was redistributed with purpose. Small farmers were given plots and training. Women's cooperatives were given resources and respect. Young entrepreneurs were given land and encouragement to innovate. Industrial zones were reserved for local businesses. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso would grow its own food, process its own goods, and build its own future. The West responded with fear disguised as concern. Sanctions were threatened, investments were withdrawn, warnings were issued. But Burkina Faso did not bend. It found new partners. It strengthened regional alliances. It proved that a nation rooted in its own soil cannot be easily shaken. And the movement spread. From South Africa to Kenya, from Mali to Namibia, from Niger to Tanzania, nations across the continent began asking the same question. If Burkina Faso can do this, why can't we? Students debated sovereignty in lecture halls. Farmers discussed land justice in markets. Social media carried the message across borders. A generation was awakening. Ibrahim Traoré did not act alone. He acted with the people. And the people did not wait for permission. They stood together. They planted seeds. They built cooperatives. They reclaimed their dignity 1 hectare at a time. The government may have written the law, but the people became the movement. And once the people rise, no force on earth can stop them. This is not the end of Burkina Faso's story. It is the beginning. The land has been reclaimed, the foundation has been laid, but the harvest is still ahead. The real measure of this reform will not be written in the next year, but in the next generation. It will be seen in children who grow up knowing the land beneath their feet is theirs.
in farmers who plant without fear, in women who own what they build, in young people who stay because there is a future worth staying for. True independence starts with the land beneath your feet. And in Burkina Faso, that land is no longer foreign. It is home. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso is a reminder to the world. Africa is not waiting anymore. Africa is rising. And the soil that was once taken is being reclaimed, not with anger, but with dignity. Not with war, but with law. Not for revenge, but for the future. Once the people rise, no force on earth can stop them.